I was in the army, and we were on a training exercise deep in the woods. We had set up camp for the night, far from any town or road. The trees were thick around us, and the only sounds were the leaves rustling and the occasional distant call of an animal. The air was cold, and a mist was starting to creep in, making the night feel even more isolated. We'd been moving all day, carrying heavy packs and gear, and by the time we set up our tents, I was exhausted. We ate quickly, using our headlamps to see what we were doing, then crawled into our sleeping bags. The forest was dark, with only the faint glow of our campfire and the dim lights of our headlamps to break through the blackness. Lying in my tent, I stared up at the fabric above me, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping in. Something about this place felt wrong, but I thought it was just because I was tired, so I tried to sleep. I woke up to a strange noise. It was a low, steady thumping, like something heavy hitting the ground over and over. I listened closely, trying to figure out what it was. The sound was steady, almost like footsteps, but too heavy to be a person. I sat up and unzipped the tent quietly, peeking out into the darkness. The mist had thickened, making it hard to see much beyond the faint glow of our dying fire. I couldn't see anyone else moving, so I figured the others were still asleep. But the thumping continued, getting louder and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, my boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. I moved the light around the camp but saw nothing unusual. The sound was coming from deeper in the woods, just beyond the trees that surrounded our campsite. My gut told me to stay put, but something else, maybe curiosity or a sense of duty, pushed me forward. I walked slowly toward the noise, each step feeling heavier as the sound grew louder. The mist swirled around me, and the trees seemed to close in, their branches almost reaching out like hands in the darkness. I kept going, my breath visible in the cold air. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed, like something had been dragged through the dirt and leaves. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought the urge to turn back. But I kept going, stepping over the disturbed earth until I reached a small open area. In the middle of the clearing was a huge tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, roots sticking out in all directions. The sound was coming from behind it. I moved around the tree, flashlight aimed ahead, trying to stay calm. When I got around the tree, I froze. There was a massive pit in the ground, about 10 feet wide and just as deep. The edges were rough, freshly dug, with chunks of earth scattered around. At the bottom of the pit, something big and dark was moving slowly, the source of the thumping. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like an animal, but it was too big, its movements too deliberate. As I watched, it pulled something out of the ground, a long, thick root or maybe a branch, and slammed it against the side of the pit, over and over, creating that horrible, steady sound. The truth of what I was seeing hit me hard. This wasn't an animal. It was a person, or what used to be a person, their body covered in mud, muscles straining as they dug desperately into the ground. The hole was filled with other things too, old bones, bits of cloth, and what looked like pieces of metal or wood. It was a grave, or maybe several graves, all mashed together in one horrific pit. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This person had been digging for a long time, alone out here in the woods, their mind gone from the isolation, or maybe something worse. And now they were creating this place, this pit of death. I turned and ran back to camp as fast as I could, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When I reached the tents, I collapsed to my knees, trying to calm myself down. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I'd just seen. We left the campsite at first light, no one saying a word about the night. I never told anyone about the pit or the person digging it. But the memory of that sound, the steady thump of earth being moved, has stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. Now, whenever I'm alone in the woods, I listen carefully, dreading the day I hear it again. Because I know that if I do, it won't just be a sound in the distance. It will be close, too close, and I won't be able to turn away. The pit will be waiting, and this time, I'll be the one pulled into the darkness. Camping with a friend was something I had been excited about for weeks. We planned to hike to a remote spot, set up our tent by a quiet lake, and spend a weekend away from everything. The drive to the trailhead was calm, with only the sound of trees rustling and gravel crunching under the tires. We parked, grabbed our gear, and began the hike. The trail was hard to see, covered with thick brush and trees. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you knew exactly where it was. We made our way through the woods using an old map I found online. As we went deeper into the forest, the trees became denser, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was cooler there, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. After a couple of hours, we reached the lake. It was small and almost hidden by the trees, with a surface as still as a mirror. We chose a spot on the far side, away from any possible visitors. It was perfect. We set up the tent, collected some firewood, and got ready for the night. The first night was normal, with just the usual forest sounds around us. By the second day, we had explored the area and even found an old, abandoned cabin a short walk from our camp. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, with the roof falling in and the door barely hanging on. We peeked inside but found nothing but dust and rotting wood. It was clear no one had been there for a long time. As night fell on the second day, the forest seemed to get quieter. We sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the sense of being alone. It was the kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound: branches snapping, leaves rustling, and distant animal calls. But then we started hearing something different. At first, it was faint, almost like wind, but it wasn't. It was a low, steady hum coming from deep in the woods. We both heard it, but neither of us said anything. It was probably just a natural sound we weren't used to, but the hum grew louder, and with it came a feeling I couldn't shake. It felt like we were being watched, like something was out there, just beyond the firelight. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling only got stronger. As the night went on, the hum became more noticeable. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like a low, mechanical buzz, and it was getting closer. My heart started to race. I could tell my friend was also on edge, but we both tried to stay calm. We knew we were far from civilization, with no cell service and no easy way out. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The forest was completely silent, as if it was holding its breath. That's when we saw it, movement in the trees, just outside the fire's glow. It was fast, darting between the trees, too quick to see clearly. My stomach twisted with fear. I wanted to say something, to suggest we pack up and leave, but I couldn't find the words. The fire began to die down, casting long, flickering shadows. I grabbed more wood, but my hands were trembling. As I threw the logs on the fire, I noticed the movement had stopped. The forest was still again, but the sense of unease remained, like the tension before a storm. We hardly slept that night, and when morning finally came, we were both on edge. We decided to cut our trip short. We packed up quickly, not talking about what happened. The hike back to the car was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow seemed like it was hiding something waiting to pounce. When we finally reached the car, a wave of relief washed over me. We threw our gear in the back and left as fast as we could. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, now just a dark line on the horizon. The hum was gone, the movement was gone, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Now, even after all this time, I can't explain what happened that night. There were no ghosts or monsters, just a sound and a feeling that something was out there, something that didn't want us there. The most unsettling part? I'm not sure if it was watching us or if it knew we were leaving. Either way, I haven't been back to those woods since. Some places hold secrets we're better off never uncovering, and I know now that some experiences leave marks that never fully fade. I never expected a camping trip with my mother-in-law to become so unsettling. It was meant to be a relaxing weekend escape, just the three of us. My wife, her mother, and me. We chose a spot deep in the woods, far away from the city's noise, hoping for some peace and quiet. We set up our tents and started a fire as night fell. The forest was filled with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, but something felt off from the beginning. I figured it was just me being out of my element. After dinner, we sat by the fire, and as darkness took over, the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch and twist in strange ways. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling and went to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would help. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound against the tent. My heart started racing. I held my breath, trying to listen. The scratching stopped, replaced by a faint dragging noise. I lay there frozen, too scared to move. I must have waited hours before I finally managed to look outside. The forest was completely silent, and everything seemed normal. I went back to sleep, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. The next morning, my mother-in-law looked more tired than usual. She had dark circles under her eyes and seemed jittery. I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later, we decided to go for a hike. We followed a narrow path that led us deeper into the forest. About an hour in, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt, but they weren't ours. They were small and seemed to be going in the direction we had just come from. My skin crawled with fear, but I kept quiet, not wanting to worry anyone. When we got back to the campsite, I found my wife and her mother huddled together, looking through their belongings. Some of their personal items were missing, things that weren't just misplaced but had been taken. That night, the scratching sound came back, louder and more persistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check. The forest was completely dark, with only my flashlight cutting through the blackness. I looked around the campsite, my heart pounding hard. Then I saw it, deep, strange scratches in the dirt that made a circle around our campsite. My stomach dropped as I realized they were too precise to be made by animals. I rushed back to the tent, trying to ignore the growing fear in my gut. I made up my mind. I packed up our things and told my wife we were leaving right away. Even though she was hesitant, I was adamant. We drove home in the middle of the night, feeling a sense of relief as we left the forest behind. When we finally got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what we had escaped. The scratches, the missing items, and the unsettling noises haunted me. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned the area we camped in had a history of strange occurrences and disappearances. What scares me the most is that someone or something might have been watching us the entire time, waiting for the right moment to strike. I still wonder what would have happened if we had stayed just one more night. I remember the camping trip with my grandmother like it happened yesterday. I always called her Gran. She loved the outdoors, always saying it kept her feeling young. I wasn't as excited as she was, but I thought it would be nice to spend some time with her. We drove out to a far-off spot in the woods, far from any towns or people. Gran liked it that way, quiet and peaceful. The first day was pretty normal. We set up our tent, cooked dinner over a fire, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. Gran talked about the different plants and animals around us. Her voice was calm and steady, and it made me feel safe. like nothing could go wrong as long as she was there. That night, I fell asleep quickly, the sounds of the forest making me feel relaxed. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing bits of wood, and the night was completely dark. I could hear Gran breathing steadily from her side of the tent, so I knew she was still asleep. I tried to figure out what had woken me up. The night was still almost too quiet. I listened closely, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat, which was starting to race. I told myself it was nothing, just the unfamiliar place making me nervous, and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard it, something moving outside the tent. It was faint, like a soft shuffling through the leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other harmless animal. But then the sound got louder, closer, like whatever it was moving around our campsite. I lay there, frozen, not sure what to do. My eyes were wide open, staring into the dark, trying to see something that wasn't there. The noise stopped, and I felt a small bit of relief, thinking it had moved on. But then I heard it again, right outside the tent, just inches from where I was lying. The sound was different now, not like an animal, more like someone dragging their feet through the dirt. My mind raced with all kinds of thoughts, none of them good. I didn't want to wake Gran, thinking it might just be my imagination. But as the minutes passed, the sound didn't stop. It only got worse. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. I reached for the flashlight by my side, my hands shaking. I didn't want to turn it on, scared of what I might see. But I had to know what was out there. Just as I was about to turn on the light, the dragging sound stopped again, followed by an eerie silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something to happen. The silence dragged on, and I started to think that maybe whatever it was had left. Maybe it was all in my head, just me being paranoid about being in the woods at night. I slowly relaxed, my grip on the flashlight easing up. That's when I felt something brush against the side of the tent, right where I was sitting. It was subtle, but it was definitely there, like a hand or a branch lightly touching the tent fabric. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm down. I needed to stay clear-headed, to think this through. I decided to wait it out to see if whatever was out there would leave. But the minutes felt like hours, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustling, too close for comfort. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. No more dragging, no more rustling. Just the sound of my own breathing and Gran's soft snores. I sat there for what felt like forever, waiting for the noise to come back, but it never did. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight was shining through the trees, and everything looked so normal, so peaceful. It was hard to believe that the night before had even happened. Gran was already up, making breakfast over the fire. I didn't mention what I had heard, and she didn't say anything either. Maybe it was better that way. We packed up camp after breakfast, and I felt a strange relief as we drove away, leaving that place behind. But as we left the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with us that night, something that didn't belong. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching us from the trees. Even now, I can't explain what happened, but one thing is for sure. Something was out there, and it was watching us. I can't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had turned on that flashlight, if I had actually seen what was outside the tent. Part of me is glad I didn't, but another part of me feels like it's still out there, waiting. I won't be going back to those woods, not ever. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and dark, I can almost hear it again, that dragging sound just outside, getting closer. I decided to go camping alone in the mountains one weekend. It was something I'd always wanted to do. Just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet away from everything. I picked a spot far from other campers and set up my tent. The weather was great, and the view of the trees stretching as far as I could see was just what I needed. Being alone out there felt nice at first. As the sun started to go down, I gathered some wood and started a small campfire. I cooked some food and sat by the fire as night slowly settled in. The woods got darker and quieter with every minute, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the rustling of leaves now and then. It was peaceful, just like I'd imagined, but something felt a bit off. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just a little nervous being out here alone. When the fire began to die down, I decided to go to sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up to keep out the night. As I lay there, the quiet started to feel heavier. Every little noise outside seemed louder. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest, nothing to worry about. But then I heard something different. Heavy, slow steps on the leaves like someone walking. They were slow, steady, and coming closer to my tent. My heart started pounding, and I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and everything went silent again. I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my chest. I stayed still, too scared to move, listening closely. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. The tight feeling in my chest eased a bit, and I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or maybe a big raccoon, even though deep down, I knew no animal walks like that. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, shaken but trying not to let the night bother me. I looked around the campsite, searching for any signs of what might have been there. That's when I noticed something unsettling. In the dirt around my tent, there were clear footprints. They were human, barefoot, and much bigger than mine. I packed up my camp as fast as I could, trying to keep myself together. The feeling of being watched got stronger with every minute, even though I couldn't see anyone. I knew I had to leave. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack. As I hiked back to my car, every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the same quiet woods, stretching out in every direction, like they were hiding any sign of whoever or whatever had been there during the night. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and got out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was miles away from the campsite. I haven't been camping since that trip. I still don't know what really happened, but I know those footsteps were real. Someone was out there in the woods that night, standing right outside my tent, watching me. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is the thought that's been haunting me ever since. What if they weren't just watching me? What if they were waiting for something, a moment when I wasn't paying attention, to make their move? The more I think about it, the more I realize how lucky I was to get out of there when I did. But that luck might not hold if I ever go back. And that's something that keeps me awake at night, wondering if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to come along. The air was cool when I got to the campsite, a remote spot deep in the woods. It had been years since I was last here with my ex-wife, and now it was just me. I set up the tent, started a fire, and tried to push away the awkward memories of her. Night fell quickly, and the forest grew dark. The fire crackled softly, casting the only light in the growing darkness. I was starting to relax when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. It could have been the wind or a stray branch. I ignored it and focused on the warmth of the fire. As the night went on, the tapping grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like someone was knocking or tapping out a pattern. I checked outside the tent but saw nothing. I went back inside, but the sound was still there, now joined by a strange scraping noise. I tried to ignore it, but sleep was impossible. The noises kept getting louder and more aggressive. The tent seemed to be shaking a little, though there was no wind. I finally unzipped the flap to check outside. The night was still and silent, and the fire was dying down. I walked around the edge of the campsite, looking for anything that might explain the noises. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I spotted something odd. A shallow hole, partly covered with leaves and dirt. I could see a corner of a wooden box sticking out. My heart raced as I dug up the box. It was old, and the wood was damp. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were personal items, photos, letters, and a diary. The stuff looked like it had been buried for a long time. There was also a map with a mark pointing to a spot nearby. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I saw that the diary had entries about the campsite and the area around it. The last entry was from around the time of our last visit. It talked about someone watching from the woods and the need to leave before it was too late. Fear gripped me. I quickly packed up, deciding it was best to get out of there before anything else happened. As I drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been waiting for me to dig up the box. I never went back to that campsite, and I never told anyone about what I found. The sense of dread stayed with me, a constant reminder that some places hold dark secrets. To this day, I wonder if the things watching from the woods are still there, waiting for the next person to uncover what should have stayed buried. I decided to go camping at a spot my neighbor had mentioned. It wasn't a place many people knew about, which made it seem like the perfect escape. A quiet weekend away from the city noise sounded just right. I left early in the morning, driving through narrow, twisting roads that were lined with thick trees. As I got closer, the trees seemed to grow taller and denser, making the road darker. The road turned into a bumpy dirt path, and soon, I reached the campsite, a small open area surrounded by woods. The only sound was a distant stream, barely breaking the silence. I set up my tent and started a small fire. The day passed quietly, with nothing but the sounds of birds and rustling leaves around me. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and the woods grew even darker. The light from the fire only lit up a small area around me, leaving everything else in deep shadow. That's when I noticed something strange. The woods, which had been full of noises from animals and rustling leaves, suddenly went quiet. It wasn't a normal kind of quiet. Everything just stopped all at once. I felt a cold chill go through me, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up to small sounds, like something moving outside the tent. The noises were quiet, like something light stepping on leaves. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but with every noise, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. In the early morning hours, I heard something I couldn't ignore. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, and definitely human, moving around my campsite. They were trying to be quiet, as if they didn't want to be heard. My heart started racing as I lay there, holding my breath, listening to the slow steps. I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, hoping that whoever it was would just leave. But they didn't. Instead, they stopped right next to my tent, so close that I could hear them breathing. I waited, not knowing what to do. Every second felt like it stretched on forever. Then, without warning, The footsteps started moving away, slowly at first, then faster, until they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, too scared to move or make a sound. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to get out of there. I left the campsite and made my way back to the car, feeling like something was watching me the entire time. The woods, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt like they were hiding something dangerous. When I finally reached my car, I felt a rush of relief. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, the feeling of being watched slowly fading as I put more distance between myself and that place. But later, when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. It wasn't just in the woods, whatever it was, it followed me back. I checked the locks on my doors, double-checking each one, but the uneasy feeling never left. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft creak outside my window, like someone stepping on a loose board. I froze, barely breathing, as the sound moved closer. The same slow, careful footsteps I'd heard in the woods. It wasn't the woods that weren't as empty as they seemed. Sometimes what follows you home doesn't just stay outside. It's already inside, waiting for the right moment to let you know you were never alone. And this time, there's nowhere to run.